Hello everyone, today I'd like to start a new video series, one that is going to be focused on melodies, variations, and arrangements. So in the last video series I decided as a challenge that I would compose live a piece of music for you, and from the comments I received, several people asked me if I could actually comment on what I was doing, because I was typically just composing without really commenting on why I was doing certain things, what I was thinking. And so in this video series I will compose a melody live and then engage in a series of exercises which you can follow as well and do in your on your own to sort of train your skills at composing melodies, arranging the melodies that you compose, and various exercises. Maybe we'll get into counterpoint eventually. So here I've covered with my camera two scales from C, C4, C5, C6. So as you can see, the video covers two scales, two C major scales, going from C4 to C5, C6. And so, in the most rudimentary sense, you have the left hand, which plays the chord, and the right hand, which plays the melody. So you have the harmony on the left hand and the melody on the right hand. So very basic setup. And we'll start very, very simple. So whenever you compose a melody, a good way to start is not to go with very colorful sort of chords, very sophisticated, but keep it simple with just the fundamental and the fifth. And you'll need to have at least some basic knowledge of music theory in order to start composing, obviously, because I'm going to go into all of that. So if you find just find some tutorials online to get into basics as far as harmony and what the notes are, because I'm not going to go into all of that. We'll kind of learn as we go. So the first note of the scale when you're in C major is called the fundamental. It is the one chord where you sort of start with. Typically when you're in C, you start with that chord. The song starts with that chord, and if you remain in C, it ends with that chord. If it doesn't start the way it ends, then it sounds kind of weird. And then you have chords which basically are transitory, that you move through in order to get back to the fundamental chord. So it's all a sort of a movement of starting from the fundamental, going away from the fundamental and exploring plenty of different colors, harmonies, and then gradually moving back towards the fundamental. And in the melody, typically in the melody, you'll find that exact same structure, where you start from, basically you can start from any note, but typically the very last note of any music is always going to be C. With some exceptions, of course, but in the major cases, your note, your melody will always end with a C. Otherwise, it gives a sort of a taste of unfinishedness. Now, that's something that's an effect that you can create if you want to, but in order to keep it simple, you need to start with these ground rules. So, in order to compose the melody, what's nice is if you have these two notes, the fundamental and the fifth, it's actually enough to have a sort of a harmony bass, kind of, like a pedal tone. You call that a pedal tone. Basically, back in the days where music was really, really simple, let's say like Middle Ages, typically you had somebody that was singing a very monotone kind of melody, which was on just one note, like Ave Maria, blah 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 blah. Just like this one fundamental note, and then other voices would just go around and do various things while the other note was playing. That's called a pedal tone. And what's nice if you have those two is that you have a nice stable kind of reference and pedal tone for kind of, any melody will kind of fit within the C major, or even actually C minor here. Any melody will fit within those two notes. And so you keep that as a reference kind of for your ear, as a stabilizer, let's say, for your ideas. And you start with the melodies. Now, of course, you have to choose what kind of rhythm you want, of course, first. And that's really important to sort of get the pulse of the melody that you want. And I'm sorry if maybe what you hear is not completely synced with images. I'll try to resynchronize it in the editing. So basically, it's really important to sort of define the rhythm. Sometimes you can start defining the rhythm with the right hand with a melody, sometimes with the left hand. And typically when you start playing, you will realize whether you're actually playing something that is in 4 beats or in 3 beats. So 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Those are the 2 most common sort of time signatures that you'll find in virtually all music. And we might get into, in further videos, we might get into more exotic time signatures. But for now, let's stick with those 2. Now, one interesting thing is, how do you actually initiate or start a melody? And the start note of the melody is really important. So when you're in C major, or C minor as I can say, you can either play this scale, we'll keep major this time, or you can play this scale. Both work, or all 3 actually work. Because this is an open, so-called open chord, because I'm not defining it whether it's color. I'm not defining whether it's major, happy, or sad, minor. Very simplification of the color of the chord. Of course, it's not just a question of happy or sad, but let's leave it at that. So the first note that you play on the melody is really important. Typically, most melodies in C major will start with either C, or the 3rd, or the 5th, or the octave, which is the same as the root. So you'll have things like, first note was C. If you don't have C as a first note, then usually it's something to add more color, but you'll end up very, very soon after you've played that first note, you'll end up being drawn to one of those 3 notes. So even if I start with a D, for instance, let's try it. See, I played that D, but it pulls you towards one of the other notes. It would be strange if I'd start playing other notes. Or it would sound a little bit jazzy, I guess. Let's try. See, there's like this tension and a lot of color that's added to the music instantly when you play this chord and you avoid those key notes. Typically in classical music, you will be pulled towards playing one of these 3 notes very soon after you've played another note. If you play a F note, for instance, so you see there, I played the F and it pulled me downwards. Why? Because these 2 notes are very close together, whereas these 2 notes are 1 note more apart. And so as a rule, basically, you're always drawn to the note that is closest. So for instance, that's why when you play a G chord, for instance, that's reversed, for instance, like this, the B will always want to go to C and the D will always want to go to E. Now you could also do this, but that sounds a bit weird because you're jumping down here, and so it's always basically when you add tension, it always tends to get resolved to the note that is closest. So here, release of tension is going back to C because that's what I'm playing, the C chord. And if I play any other note, then depending on the distance between the notes, you're pulled towards one note more than the other. See? Now if I play D as I did before, I'm equally drawn to C or to E. So either of those work. Now let's try another note. Now when I play an A with that chord, I'm immediately kind of in a kind of bluesy color, because I'm playing one of the notes of the pentatonic, and it reminds you of a minor sixth chord, which is very pentatonic and bluesy in nature. But again, I'm drawn to the E. Not really upwards. If I do that, then it sounds a little bit less classical, a bit more jazzy, I guess, or dreamy. But you can, of course, do just about anything in music, but it depends what you want to express, basically. It's up to you. And it would be a bit stranger if I do this, for instance. Than this, because the G is closer to the A. Of course, it still works, obviously, because you hit the right note to release the tension that the A has brought into the picture, into the harmonic picture. But, you know, typically you resolve closest. And the same if I play B, but this is very rare. Like, you'll very rarely find melodies that when you are in a C major chord, and you start with a C major chord, that would start with a B, because then you're immediately in a kind of a jazzy kind of color, where you have a C major 7 chord, and so you won't find that very often. Sometimes what you have, and this is also another thing. So now I've covered basically all the notes that you can start a melody from, and the tendency of the notes that are not part of the chord, which is C, E, and G, to, when you start the melody from any other note, it kind of tends to go to quickly resolve back into one of these notes that you hit them, so you release the tension that is brought forward by playing a note that is outside of the chord. Now, another thing that you have to keep in mind in melodies is that there are 3 major ways rhythmically to start the melody. One, the most typical, is to start the melody with the first beat. So as soon as the music starts, like twinkle, twinkle, little, starts immediately with the chord. But then you have melody where you have a few notes before the start of the melody, and I think it's called a anacroust, but I know some of these terms in French, so bear with me. So that's basically when you play a series of notes before the actual chord starts, as a sort of a launching, you know, mechanism, like you launch the melody. So you see what I've done there is I've kind of played a series of notes before the music starts. Like you have like a measure, and the melody starts before the chord actually hits the first beat. That's one way to start the melody, and there, of course, these rules of starting the melody on one of these 3 notes or resolving or whatever. You can actually have plenty of very sophisticated things before the melody starts, but you noticed that the moment where the first chord hit, I was on a C. Typically, when you launch a melody before the music starts, it sounds less weird if you actually hit one of those 3 notes of your first chord for the start of your melody. Let me try and do it without hitting those notes. See, it sounds a little bit stranger because you expect something different. But I mean, okay, you can do it, like I said, you can do anything. It's about what kind of color you want to bring into the picture. But typically, again, if you play a series of notes before, typically you hit one of those three notes as a sort of a launch. And you can do a lot of things with that. Like... So the last one is where the melody starts after the beat. So the last one is where the melody starts after the first beat. So let's see. See, the chord hit and then the melody started afterwards. Let's try another one. And so those are already a lot of different ways, a lot of different sort of methods that you can use to diversify the way that you start your melodies, and yeah, just to make them sound a bit more interesting and not always start on the beat, not always start on one of the three key notes, and like just basically train yourself to just improvise on the keyboard using this kind of pedal tone as a reference and see what works, like just keep a pedal tone and improvise on it, and you sort of get the hang of melodies quite quickly. Another tip that I can give you when you try to devise a nice melody is to understand that it's basically like poetry or like language. Like if I really speak to you without having breathers in my voice, just speak in a very, very monotonic thing like this and never stop, and then it sounds really bad. And the same is if I'm too hesitant. There's a rhythm to the way you speak. There's a rhythm to the way you write poetry, which is very much, which you find very much in music as well. And so that's one way that you can sort of try and train yourself is if the way that you compose or play the melody actually sounds like someone speaking to you and saying like different phrases. Like, let me see. Hi, how are you? What are you doing today? And just like train yourself to speak, for instance, as you play, like, how are you doing? What is going on with you? I don't know what to do today. And just try to use these exercises to get the feeling for what kind of rhythms you want in your melody, what kind of notes, what kind of expressions. So let's just try something. Now here it was typically a 3/4 kind of rhythm, so bum 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 1 2 3 1 2 3. Now let's try a 4/4. course, when you do these kinds of exercises, don't expect that every single one of your melodies is going to be the next ultra hit. But the more you practice this kind of simple improvisation, the more you sort of, how should I say, cultivate your inspiration and the fluidity of your ideas, and you start even hearing melodies, which I typically do when I compose. I compose usually using the mouse click, not even playing many of the things on the keyboard first, just because you start hearing melodies in your head and you instinctively can start to just click them into place with your mouse, even the rhythms. So if you go back to the videos that I've made about where I compose live, you'll notice that I don't really test or play things on the keyboard that much before actually putting them down. So I think we'll stop here, and in the next video I'll just improvise a melody and then build on that melody. Well, actually I'll compose two melodies and then build on those melodies. First, trying to see what kind of harmonies can be added around that. Look at harmonic variations around a melody. That's going to be the program. And then we'll get into arrangements. We'll get into playing it with different instruments. We'll get into plenty of different things that hopefully will be interesting to you. So I'll leave it at that and see you next time.